Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this IWFM webinar, now as the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management, as most of you now know. So really looking forward to feeding back on our sustainability survey that's been running for a number of years, and a survey that's very close to the Institute's hearts, as well as tackling such a major agenda for FMs and the built environment. So today we will go through with two experts around the field of sustainability, tackling not only the survey results, but the changing landscape of sustainability and what that truly means to not only the Institute, but the built environment in general. So I'm Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight, and there's a picture of me there. Maybe need to change my picture, that's a few years old now, so reminds me maybe to get a more up-to-date picture. I have changed a lot since then, I don't think that much. But more on a serious note, what I'm responsible for, what my team is responsible for, as well as the volunteers and experts that are on this webinar help us to achieve, is producing first-class research and insight, supporting FMs through guidance and material as well as knowledge, so giving back, which we believe the webinars is one platform that we do that, and developing content. And when we mean developing content, that's a visual representation of what I mean. And there's an insight, if you've not seen it already, of the sustainability report for 2018, which will be discussed on this webinar. So that's on the right hand of your screen there, as well as our good practice guides and our guidance notes. And these can be found on the brand new IWFM website under Insights. And essentially they're guidance material that help you across a number of FM themes, and generally how to do something and how to do it well is a simple way of describing our guidance, and that's a range of themes and areas important to FMs, as well as you'll find our latest research reports under Insights as well. As I've already mentioned, the sustainability report is available to download from there. So today isn't about me and presenting what we do. I think it's giving you a nutshell of what the purpose of research and information is, as well as our Insights team. But today we've got two speakers to discuss around the sustainability agenda, and you've got pictures of them there so you know what they look like. And we're going to start with Manish Datta, Senior Consultant for UK Green Building Council and Working Group Chairman of the IWFM Sustainability and FM Survey, so helped us our peer reviewer on the actual report. And there's a real strong track record of Manish, with many of you may already know the gentleman in question. A very knowledgeable man, has a very strong corporate leader track record of creating strategy and developing operational outcomes, resulting in substantial commercial, environment, social and reputational benefits. He has a passion about the crucial role of every sector of society, government, business, must play to actually create a truly sustainable world. And until recently, he led the team to design and deliver Marks and Spencer's multi-award winning, globally renowned sustainability strategy, Plan A, for its 4 billion, 1,000+ builders property portfolio. So that's possibly where a lot of our listeners may have came across Manish before. So his new role is as Senior Consultant at the UK Green Building Council, leading the development and delivery of its strategy, and Senior Associate and Member of Faculty at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And this is empowering business leaders and organisations to tackle the critical global challenges. He's also, and you can already see he's a busy man, a member of the UK Government BIS, Green Construction Board, providing leadership and action to enable the property industry to become more environmentally sustainable and economically productive. Also, he's a member of the advisory board at the University of Oxford Masters in Sustainable Urban Development, and a trustee of Rama Foundation, a charity building capacities and skills of disadvantaged communities. So hopefully with that intro and bio around the gentleman that's about to speak, there's a vast knowledge and experience in this important agenda of sustainability for a number of years that cross-cuts across academia as well as the commercial world. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Manish to hear from the man himself about sustainability, and as I would describe it, the changing landscape of sustainability and what that truly means to the FM sector. So Manish, hopefully the software doesn't let me down.
Thank you very much indeed for that very grand and a little bit undeserved introduction, Peter. I'm delighted to be here and talk and engage with colleagues across this webinar about what these built environment sustainability trends are. And I was very, very pleased actually to peer review the sustainability survey earlier this year, which Greg will cover in a bit. So my job really is to talk about the trends, the disruptive forces that are affecting the built environment, the implications for the sector, how the sector is responding, some of the radical ideas that it's coming up with, and the implications, frankly, for it if it doesn't respond. So that's what I'd like to go through in the next sort of 20 or so minutes. So let's just start with the sheer sort of hard facts, really. Buildings are responsible for a massive, massive environmental footprint. So they consume 40% of global energy consumption, both in the way they're constructed, but also importantly for this audience in the way that they're operated and maintained. And that equates to about 30% of worldwide carbon emissions, primarily, again, in the operation of those buildings, but also generated as they're built and all the energy that's required to create materials, etc., that go into buildings. And talking about materials, they actually use 30% of all global resources that are available to us as humanity. So a massive, massive, global footprint. And then when you contrast that with some of what the scientists are telling us in terms of global warming, and across the top of this slide, you'll see the well-known sort of degree tranches of global warming: 1.5, 2, and 3, and there are others, obviously. And here are some of the implications of each of those sort of degree changes based on what scientists have calculated and we're experiencing. So we're already above 1 degree. And if we hit what's recommended to be, the point of at which we mustn't go beyond, which is 1.5, we'll already have seen sea level rises, as you can see on the screen. Drought lengths, which are in months here, going from 2 to 4 months when you go to 2 degrees. And then a hugely exponential increase in biodiversity and species loss, and then coral reef loss as well. So, when you add all that, one of the human impacts of that is that the number of premature heat-related deaths is expected to more than triple by the 2050s. So this is a very, very serious matter for us, which is creeping up much quicker than anyone expected. Let's bring it back down to buildings, though, because that's what we're here to talk about. So, there's no denying that the scale of the challenge is very substantial when you look at buildings. A huge proportion of these are all the UK numbers that you can see on this slide. A huge proportion of the sort of national carbon footprint is attributable to buildings. Existing buildings, new buildings are very energy hungry and largely inefficient. They don't perform as they're intended. They're not very resilient to extreme weather, homes in particular, as you can see on the slide. We consume a lot of materials, as I've mentioned already, but also produce a lot of waste, as you can see from this 59% number. And also, the housing market in particular is unfortunately reinforcing some of the sort of inequalities that exist in society, which I'll talk about a bit later. So the built environment has quite a lot of an impact. At the UK Green Building Council, we are trying to mitigate those impacts in these 5 broad areas. So climate change, resource use, nature, biodiversity, health and well-being, and socioeconomics. And I'd like to go through these now in the next sort of 10, 12 minutes in turn and just talk about some of those big disruptive trends and responses that are coming about. Let's start with climate change. And let's just talk about the impact of the UK buildings, sort of built environment as a whole in terms of carbon. And you can see there in the big circle in sort of the purplish color that the total sort of carbon impact of UK is 831, of which 349 million tons of carbon equivalent actually comes from building sector, which is about 42%. So a massive chunk, the largest of any sector. And when you break that number down, you can see here on this slide that actually most of it is from existing buildings and mostly from the operation of existing buildings. So there is quite a big chunk from transport to and from buildings, but also construction, but 22% or 185 million tons is from buildings. So buildings are a major contributor, existing buildings and their operation, the large chunk of that is the big summary. And we don't help ourselves. This next slide, and this data, all of it is from the Green Construction Board, but actually the next slide shows that we try and design buildings to be, even new buildings, to be fairly efficient. But what we see in reality is that even in best practice, that we oversell our predictions for energy use or carbon use in buildings by some 80%. And unfortunately, typically that can be up to 250% more energy or carbon used in the operation of a building than intended. So this is not good, especially when you consider that 60% of the buildings that are built existed 50 years ago and probably will still exist in 30 years. So the carbon impact between the EPC calculation or the intended design calculations and typical buildings and even exemplar buildings is massive. There's a massive gap, which is very popularly known as the carbon or energy performance gap in buildings, a massive issue that the FM sector has a big role to play in actually closing this gap. Along with those sort of carbon numbers, there are some other major trends that are emerging, some of which you'll all be quite familiar with. So plastic pollution up to 18 months ago was a relatively unknown or certainly understated environmental issue. But of course, due to television programs and huge media focus and general consumer awareness, this has become a big issue. Equally, the issue of the sort of what I'm calling sort of the teenage uprising against climate change, mainly brought about by the views of Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swede that's become a very familiar face now. But striking students right across the world is becoming quite commonplace now. So I suppose consumer expectation, people's expectation is rising on this topic like never before, and they've reached certain tipping points in their consciousness that is making them behave in much more activist ways. Financial pressures are certainly becoming more important, and transparency has become a big buzzword in this. So the Bank of England, not so long ago, this is from October in 2018, big headline in the FT here about what the Bank of England is demanding of big institutions. And then some of you may be familiar with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which actually is now requiring disclosure about climate risk from investors, lenders, insurers, and other stakeholders. And this is a report I'd encourage you to have a look at if you're interested. And then actually companies are starting to understand this reputationally as well. All of this largely around carbon. So they're starting to set science-based carbon targets, not just for their own operations, but their entire value operations. And increasing number of companies, 62 in total, are now committing to 100% and have committed to 100% renewable energy sourcing. And in the real estate, in the built environment sector, benchmarks looking at environmental, social, and governance sort of criteria, GRESB as the example here, are becoming much more important. So there are many drivers now to closing the gap on building performance, particularly from a carbon point of view. Consumer pressures, governmental and transparency pressures, and indeed reputational pressures that are forcing the hand. And the government, the UK government, actually have been taking this very seriously in the last 12 to 18 months with a series of different consultation documents. Probably the best known one is the industrial strategy. So in my role with the Green Construction Board, been working quite closely with colleagues in BEIS to look at the industrial strategy, particularly around the energy use in buildings. And the aim actually to make sure that we are halving energy use in buildings by 2030 is really important. And actually cities, not just government, not just the UK government, but cities have been taking a big lead on this. The UK Green Building Council works a lot with cities, and they're going further and faster than perhaps even governments are, and the UK government is. And Manchester, late last year, adopted a policy to be carbon neutral by 2038. Soon it was followed by Bristol, who trumped that to 2030. And Nottingham actually, has recently come out and said we'd like to be a zero carbon city by 2028. All of whom are now turning that very big ambition into local legislation and building regs, which themselves at a national scale are being reviewed, but actually not just Bristol, Manchester, London, and Nottingham, but cities like Cambridge, Brighton, Guildford, etc., have all now got policies and that go beyond the Part L building regulations in terms of energy efficiency. So this whole area is becoming much more important at a local level. At the UK GBC, we've also been campaigning very hard on net zero buildings. We have a net zero program, which you can see a large and unprecedented degree of support has come across from every part of the industry to look at the principles of net zero carbon, and we're working with them to inform government policy and come up with tools, and some of those compulsory, some of those voluntary, and the government actually are a very keen observer in this piece of work to look at how we can actually define what net zero means and how we actually achieve it. I want to just turn our attention now really to not just carbon mitigation, which is what I've been talking about up till now, but actually talk about carbon adaptation and climate adaptation. So, yesterday was the warmest February day ever in the UK, and of course we last summer experienced an incredible heat wave, and you'll have seen maps like this one, and of course the UK as well in the bottom left corner of the screen, which experienced unprecedented levels of heat in the summer, the hottest summer on record last summer. But actually, this isn't exceptional, and that's what we're realizing. This is actually going to become the new normal. An extreme climate, whether it be heat or flooding, is going to be something that our buildings are going to have to learn to cope with. But that's the key. Are our systems commissioned in the right way? Are our operations able to cope, and the systems, heating and cooling systems in buildings, able to cope with this new climate that is becoming increasingly normal? That's a big question that we need to answer in existing buildings. And of course, when we're designing new ones, thinking about how we go about doing those to be able to cope with different temperatures in the future. I want to now just turn attention to resource use and just talk about some of the facts again in the UK around resource use. So according to RAP, this is data from RAP, total resource use in the UK in 2015 was circa 576 million tonnes, of which 345 million tonnes is all around the built environment sector, so 60% in percentage terms. And if you look at the amount of waste it still produces, around about 120 million tonnes, which is 60% of total waste produced, it's shocking actually that we should be looking at these kinds of statistics. And the financial cost actually is about, of this waste to firms in the built environment sector, is about 30% of pre-tax profit. So there's a massive financial lever as well. When you consider, the fact that due to extreme weather and other factors, we're also seeing scarcity of materials that are required to run buildings and build buildings. And the fact that, the materials cost of those have increased 5% from May 2017 to May 2018, based on data from Bayes. There's a massive financial opportunity as well as an environmental opportunity. And the government have actually recognized this. And there's a new ambitious resources and waste strategy that they've launched that's out for consultation as well, which of course does focus on food waste and plastic waste and other things, but also looks at, and the Green Construction Board is working on, the waste that's generated out of buildings, both in their construction, but more importantly for colleagues on this webinar in terms of their operation as well. And there's some really exciting initiatives in terms of responses to this issue that are emerging. So I want to introduce you to this initiative, Buildings as Material Banks, which has got 15 partners from 7 different countries that are working together to enable a real shift in the way we create and maintain buildings and make them more circular. And it requires actually a very high level. I'd encourage you to look at this outside the webinar. We won't have time to go into it in great depth, but looking at the culture, you know, we design buildings primarily at the moment for single use, not thinking about what they might become in the future when that use is no longer relevant, thinking about retail, thinking about banks, etc., that are now needing to change their use. Also thinking about, you know, the financial cost benefit of buildings. And if we can make them more reusable and more adaptable and more demountable and changeable, maybe their value would be better conserved through time, and people, you know, asset owners will hold on to those assets longer. And of course, all of this is only really achievable if we have a good data bank and we use technologies such as artificial intelligence and BIM to correctly asset tag buildings, but actually share that data in a really open, maybe blockchain-y way across all the actors in the sort of built environment, from, you know, it being a chain of, you know, people handing it over from one chain to the other to actually becoming a network. So a really exciting piece of work. Another piece of work that I would like to just, I suppose, tag in the webinar here is this really good circular economy guide, office guide that the business in the community came up with last year, which again looks at prioritizing and really sort of retaining the value in buildings through a number of those sort of circular criteria within the guide that will help everyone involved, particularly in offices, landlords, tenants, managers, FM colleagues, procurement teams, and employees, to identify opportunities and turn these into, you know, these circular opportunities into practice. So again, I'd just like to draw your attention to it, not necessarily go through it. So I want to talk about nature and biodiversity next. Yeah, there's some really big, shocking statistics that the World Wildlife Fund Living Planet report that comes out every year, the last one came out in 2018, late 2018, said that there'd been a 60% decline in wildlife populations since 1970. And actually, the built environment is very responsible for this. Have a look at this bit of data. So, you know, there's been that sort of 60% decline, as I've mentioned, at the same time as us in the UK converting around 22,000 hectares of green space into artificial surfaces, more primarily for the built environment. So whilst the built environment is taking up green space, it can also, based on the experience I had at Marks & Spencer, actually be a great host to creating new habitats for biodiversity. These are some examples of Marks & Spencer stores, some 11 or 12 in total where we did this. And not only did they create great sort of biodiversity gain on these buildings, they also helped insulate them, they helped beautify them in many respects, helped clean up the pollution in these areas, and actually motivated the people that were coming in and out of them. So a real win-win. The UK Green Building Council have recently done some great work with sort of real leaders in this space, looking at not just the sort of benefit to nature, but also some of the commercial benefits to greening up built environment space and maintaining it both internally and externally, as this example from Blue Water Shopping Centre in Kent. So again, have a look out for that report. I want to just turn to health and well-being, which is related in many ways to nature and biodiversity. But just some startling facts really before I get into it. 63% of adults in the UK were overweight or obese in 2015 based on the HSC statistics. And the gap of life expectancy between sort of rich and poor people in the UK is now larger than ever than the early 70s. And I suppose you're probably questioning, well, how's this linked to the built environment? I'll cover some of this in the socio-economic section next, but air quality has been a big sort of focus area, and again has had great public sort of response in the past. And this you'll know this place, I'm sure, from this slide, but probably don't think that this is true in terms of representation. You'd think maybe someone's exaggerated this picture, but actually this is an artist, a photographic artist's impression of, if you could see all the pollution, because our eye, the human eye can't see all the pollution that's generated, this is what a typical street in London would look like. Actually, London's air quality is halfway between good and moderate. It's, based on the air quality index that's defined by the World Health Organization, it's about 25. But even then, places like London, and this is, probably typical of many city centres in the UK, according to statistics, UK experiences 40,000 human deaths attributable to poor air quality, outdoor air quality. So this is becoming a big health and well-being issue. And consumers are becoming very, very powerful in being able to understand this issue. So this is a product produced by a company called Plume Bags. It's a tag that something you can attach to your bag and walk around and put, it measures air as you commute. And in fact, the same company have also armed pigeons with sensors that fly around in cities to measure air quality. And you can then go onto an app to look at your commute or the pigeon's flight and actually look at the air quality during your commute. Now, the personal air pollution sensor means that you can know how much pollution you've taken in as you've done your commute, and it might actually encourage you to change your commute, or in many cases, not necessarily in the UK, but in other countries, it's actually made people move out of cities. So air pollution, really, really important. Bringing it back to buildings, though, and not sort of city-wide outdoor pollution, this is some work done by both the World Green Building Council and the UK Green Building Council, looking at health and well-being impact in buildings. And you'll see these statistics. We focus a lot, and I have in this webinar, on energy costs, and of course, commercial people look also at rental costs, but look at the staff costs in relation to all that. 90% of the costs of a building are actually people. So a variation of 10% in people's productivity, people's health and well-being can have a magnificent, a monumental impact on their performance, on the cost, the real cost of running a building. And whether it's offices or shops, there's some really important lessons to learn about health and well-being in building, another big trend that is emerging in the built environment. Socioeconomics, another really important factor in all this. We're going to talk a lot, Greg in particular is going to talk about social value and the rising awareness of social value within the sector. But there are some really, really shocking statistics that really bring this home. And scenes like this one on this slide are not now untypical, unfortunately, are becoming quite commonplace in high streets across the country. 14 million people in the UK, which is about a fifth of the population, live in poverty. Child poverty in particular, between 2015 and 2022, is expected to rise by 7%. And 11% of households, based on government figures, are currently living in fuel poverty. These are all really shocking statistics. And if you then just look into housing, the housing crisis is driving inequality in the UK. As the poorest fifth are now forced to spend, as you can see from the red line here, an increasing amount on housing based on an increasingly higher proportion of their income on housing. And in fact, the prediction is that by 2040, private rents in the UK could rise by 90% compared to 2008, pushing 50% of private renters, who also probably are in the sort of red line and sort of pink line category, into further poverty. So we are facing a real housing crisis. Beyond housing, though, and related to housing, related to housing, we're not actually even meeting the basic needs from things like repairing housing and the number of people that live in poor quality housing, fuel poverty, homelessness. We're just not, as an economy, as a developed economy in the UK, able to satisfy even basic social needs. And back in 2012, then the government recognized these issues and brought about, particularly for public services, the Social Value Act. But this topic is becoming really important amongst investors, developers, contractors, and of course, local authorities. And we're trying to define as a sector as a whole what this means, but they're requiring, they're sort of trying to define a new, for private sort of organizations, a new sort of transition to a more caring capitalism. And in the built environment, you're looking at, the development process is the benefit of the development of the built environment to people, residents, local businesses, wider communities, and cities from every point in the building cycle, particularly in operation. So we'll talk a bit more about this in the second part of this webinar from what Greb's going to talk about, but it's rising in terms of its importance. And a couple of organizations within buildings are taking this very seriously. Again, won't go into this in great detail, but look up the Loneliness Lab by Lendlease, which is identifying opportunities with a charity called Collectively, to look at reimagined places and spaces in cities where loneliness and isolation would be an issue. Redrow, a big housing developer, has actually created this social value calculator, which is a forecasting tool to help calculate the value, the social value, to help the business enhance the business case for design decisions to deliver better outcomes for residents and local communities. £34 million, the amount of social value that they reckon their developments have created. So some interesting work there. I'm just going to touch very briefly on modern slavery, which is very much within the sort of social value area. I'm not sure how much webinar colleagues will be familiar with the Modern Slavery Act, but you'll see by those really stark statistics that slavery very much still exists today and has risen tenfold since 2013 in the UK to now 136,000 people based on government statistics that would be classified as modern slaves. And in fact, last year, we had the highest number of cases recorded in the UK, and 41% of those cases were children under the age of 18. So this is not a very pretty picture whatsoever. And actually, construction and sort of FM sector is identified as one of the highest risk areas. So much work to do here, and probably the subject of another webinar in itself. I want to just turn to sort of solution mode now, and some of the responses. And technology, of course, is playing a massive response. In Cambridge, the Centre for Digital Build Britain, which has just received huge amount of government funding under the Industrial Strategy Clean Growth Mission I spoke about earlier. And if you look at this whole sort of slide, which looks at the whole property cycle as such, but particularly around how technology is helping us to operate buildings, smart buildings comes into this sort of sector in a much more resource efficient way to improve their not just performance, but also the provision of the services that buildings provide to their users. Certainly the digitization of buildings is becoming important. And a couple of examples here, again, throughout the building cycle, but you'll see architects, for example, increasingly using virtual reality to imagine what buildings are like so that we can eliminate any of the mistakes that might be made in constructing them wrongly. You look at robots actually building and fitting out buildings. Really nice product here about insulating existing buildings from a company called Qbot, which is a robotic spray insulation system, which has attracted great investment. And of course, building information modeling, which enables asset tagging and hopefully the management of assets in operation much better in the future. All these things emerging. And just, the tech companies are taking this very seriously as well. Google, who own an artificial intelligence research company called DeepMind, used DeepMind's technology to look at their data centers and use artificial intelligence to try and look at where energy wastage was occurring and actually reduced energy, particularly around cooling, you can imagine, which is quite important in a data center, by 40%. And that's a great carbon and financial result. So one last framework I just want to introduce everyone on the webinar to is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is kind of a framework for the globe, really, to adopt a more sustainable approach from a business, from a city, from a community point of view, from a government, from a local authority, from a mayor point of view. And cities and buildings are a big feature of that. Again, I won't go into it in great detail. I don't have the time for that, but I just want to highlight this for you to be able to look into. But this is a holistic approach to what buildings, both socially, environmentally, and economically, must achieve, so that they can achieve the kind of outputs that are on this slide, that mitigate and adapt to climate change, become much more resource efficient, and become sort of hosts for nature and biodiversity, be health and health and promote great well-being for the people that are in them, and to create long-term value for society. The role of FM in all of those things is undeniable and very, very important. So hopefully what I've done in the last sort of 25 minutes is just show you in a whistle-stop tour as to what those trends, etc. are. Look forward to exchange some thoughts through questions shortly. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Manish. That was a wonderful presentation, and I bet most of our audience wasn't expecting a picture of a pigeon. So from that point of view, a great slide information and a lot of information covered there. So I'm just waiting for the tech to kick it back in again. So yeah, just to remind yourself who the gentleman Manish Datta is, and also his @ManishDatta hashtag there. So from this point of view, at this point in the webinar, I should say, is we'd like to encourage you to send your questions through. We do have a dedicated Q&A session. So we give Manish a bit of respite, so he will be rejoining us for our Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. But I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Greg Davis. And Greg is a great guy. I'll start off with that. I've worked with Greg. I've been now 5 years at the Institute, and Greg has been pivotal as part of our sustainability agenda on our special interest group, as well as a number of other key themes he supported the Institute on. And Greg has worked for over 30 years in health and safety and environmental compliance. So another speaker here today, ladies and gentlemen, with a raft of experience. So compliance management covering aspects including Legionella, health and safety, fire asbestos, building environment quality, energy, waste and sustainability, just to name a few areas there. He's a degree qualified microbiologist, and he joined Assurity Consulting in 1989 and is a specialist member of the International Institute of Risk and Safety Management. He's also the committee member, as already mentioned, of the IWFM Sustainability Special Interest Group and the IIRSM London branch. Some of you may be aware of Greg because he is a regular blogger and contributor to our industry press, with over 200 articles published on health and safety, risk environment, management and sustainability. He chaired the CIPSI committee that revised the TM13, was also the author of the original Good Practice Guide to Risk Management, and as already mentioned, he is survey lead for the IWFM Sustainability and FM survey for the last 5 years. So that's how I've built a relationship over with Greg. So at this point, enough from me. You've got some background to Greg and what he's about. So I'm just about to pass over the control to Greg to go through essentially the slides and information around the sustainability survey and what is it telling us, and also conclude with some of the points that was raised in Manish's presentation. So over to you, Greg.
Peter, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start. I've titled this Sustainability, What's in a Word, as I think one of the things we've seen over the 12 years of the Sustainability Special Interest Group survey is that what actually sustainability means to organisations has changed, but it's not the only word in our lexicon that has changed. And I put 5 up there that have recently come into common practice, shall we say, our common language. Some of you may be familiar with some of them, some maybe not, and we'll come back and look at these in a little bit more detail about how they've changed at the end of the presentation. But the purpose of my talk today is twofold, fundamentally. One is to get you to all download and use this year's report. It is full of some very good information. And then secondly, hopefully to encourage you to contribute to next year's survey. So this is a copy of the survey report for 2018. And in terms of the first thing, with those people who fed back to us the information on the survey, one of the things that has endured over the whole length of the survey is the number of end users, number of facilities managers that respond directly. And you will see from the demographic here, over 60% were end user facilities managers, and then a further 20% came from facilities management companies, comprising the vast bulk of those people who provide information back into the survey findings. In terms of the roles and responsibilities, again, it reflected all types of business groups from CEO right the way through to frontline managers and staff. Again, 40% being of a managing director or senior management level. Similarly, with size of organisations for this year's survey, from very large to micro, again, represented and quite consistently, with 26% being from very large organisations, that's over 5,000 employees, 25% from those organisations employing between 1,000 and 5,000 people, 22% from 250 to 1,000, and then 27% from organisations with less than 250 people. So it was very rounded in terms of its supply. The next thing we have is key findings that came out of the report, and we looked at mining the data back over the last 5 years, as opposed to who saw sustainability from overall level of importance within the organisation. At executive management level, from 2015 to 2018, 80% of those identified sustainability as being very or even greater in importance. And that went from 81% in 2015, has dropped slightly to 70% in 2016, and then regained. So 75% for this year's survey. Middle managers remained between 60 and 70%, and frontline staff, frontline managers and staff varied far more significantly. If you look at the figures, particularly from 2017 to 2018 for frontline managers and staff, you will see they went from 75% to 56% this year. So there's a drop in engagement there. One of the things, and one of the reasons this could be, is in 2016 the report saw very much people at the forefront of sustainability. So it was looking at retention, it was looking at recruitment. Organisational engagement was seen to have dropped, and perhaps that's what we found, that big increase in the results in 2017, but maybe that has lost a little bit of its focus. So what is being seen as sustainability in the organisation, and how's that being recognised at different levels, is one of the key findings. So that figure there was very, very important as far as the information went. Second key finding is looking at the influences in terms of driving the implementation of sustainability practices within organisations. And historically, we've had the main drivers in terms of the legal, the moral, the financial, and the reputational drivers, as you will see through corporate image, organisational ethos, leadership, life cycle, and legislation. They've tended to predominate in terms of driving sustainability and its implementation within the organisation. This year we also had a number of other areas that started to come into affecting what people saw as sustainability and how it was being viewed. A lot of the new disruptors, so technology, innovation, we saw those change. Management of material risk came in as another element, and also second from the bottom you will see social pressure. Monish has already talked about what happened with plastic, particularly from the programmes we saw on BBC last year, and how that affected public opinion, so social pressure. Two more elements to look at from this year's survey in terms of driving an influence, and one is pressure from employees and the other is pressure from shareholders. This is a trend we have been mapping for a number of years, but you will see comes from a very low base in the 2013, which is the green figure to the left-hand side of the graph, but both of them have increased year on year to now 44 for shareholder pressure and 53% from employees in terms of providing pressure towards sustainability. So we're seeing not just a bottom-up, but a top-down reflection on the organisation as to what we should be doing about sustainability. One of the things within that could be, what are the agendas from each of these groups? And perhaps that's why we're seeing this difference in terms of what the organisation is doing or how it's being recognised for what it's doing, either by staff or its wider audience. Historically, the surveys focused very much on the environmental aspects of the subject. In more recent years, what we've also looked to do is take on some of the bigger issues or some of the trends that the survey's been identifying and look at those in a little bit more detail. Last year, the survey looked at, as well as social value, it looked at energy benchmarking and digitalisation. This year, we concentrated more effort into social value, but also looked at sustainable procurement. And one of the questions, having identified social value as being a particularly strong topic in our industry over the last 2 years, 18 months, is what activities the firm consider to be the most important in terms of delivering social value. And while environmental activities remained at the top at 94%, we will see there is a raft of other areas reflecting the social and the economic, which organisations believe are important in terms of delivering their social value. So in answer to the question, what do you believe is most important? It's actually all of them through all these, with the charity partnerships at 65% at the bottom. So with this view that everyone sees the social value agenda as being important, how is it then being measured was the next question we asked. So we had a range of responses here, of which you will see at the bottom go on. 39% is we don't measure it in any way at all. So while it is important, it's not being measured within the organisation. Following on from that, we have using our own internal metrics, or it's carried out as part of our wider corporate social responsibility reporting. Again, both in the 30%. So organisations are doing something about looking at this, but what is actually being achieved? Are we looking at social value perhaps as we looked at energy 10, 15 years ago, where people believing and are seeing it's important, but are actually running their own agenda or setting their own targets or using their own metrics to measure it? And in which so, how can we compare and contrast? How do we as an industry get an overall view of this? And perhaps this is something else we need to be considering looking forward into the future. Sustainable procurement, as I said, was the other area we looked at considering, and again we covered this from two perspectives. The first one to say, how has this changed for you over the last 12 months in terms of the amount of sustainability information you're being asked to provide as part of your tenders? Has this increased, decreased, or stayed the same? And for no organisation, it'd be unsurprising to note it didn't decrease. It has either stayed the same at 38%, or for the remainder, the other 62%, it's actually increased a little or increased quite a bit. So this is the information that we need to provide, but what actually is that information? So a follow-up question, a secondary question to that was, to what extent are your tenders reflecting the different aspects of sustainability? So looking at the triple bottom line here, the social, the environmental, and the economic. And environmental, again, was the predominating factor. So while we have seen this shift over to more social, community, health and well-being, as Munish has talked about, the development of these areas, staff retention, staff recruitment, environment is still the predominant element that's being considered in tenders. Social value, we'll see, was 8%. Local economic agenda, 16%. Equally, so looking at them in the blend was the second, that was at the top of the list there in 26%. So there is still some development needed here to say what are actually organisations looking for when they're asking what information do you want, and what are we delivering, but more importantly, how are we measuring what we're delivering and confirming what we say we're doing. So the environment there being the most element, as we can see. One of the long-term questions we've asked over the survey relates to trends and targets. So this is looking at what KPIs or targets do you have in place for your organisation in terms of measuring sustainability. And I don't know if people are aware, but whenever you deliver a sustainability or a health and safety presentation, it is a legal requirement to have one very complicated graph. So in fulfilling that requirement, we've produced this. as part of the survey. And this then looks at, so 3 elements. What is being produced is in the light blue. So yes, we have a target or a KPI. The dark blue is no, we don't. And the green figure here is we don't know whether we have a target or not. And this paints a slightly different picture again as to where we are. Because if we look at the high level, over 70% of organisations have targets and KPIs. It's actually health and safety that predominates, and again, that tends to have been a recurring theme throughout the length of time of the survey. Following on from that, the second one at 60% is waste management and recycling. How much that's been influenced over the last year by plastics, we don't know, but it's certainly up there as being an element that organisations have specific targets, specific measures, specific KPIs in place to monitor. Our third group then captures carbon and training and development, which again, that carbon, that energy and training have been long time subjects at the higher end of sustainability KPIs and targets. And following on from that, when we get down to 40%, we start to see some of the, as we've described it in the report, the newer kids on the block. So equality and diversity. Munesh again talked about modern slavery, talked about some of the areas such as living wage within that look to be incorporated into this agenda. So an increasing one as far as equality and diversity goes. Water's included in there, as is staff productivity. Recruitment and retention, and health and well-being, another developing agenda. It was, along with social value, providing well-being measurements was one of the future targets. The long look from the 2016-2017 survey as to where do you think facilities will have an influence, what do you think will be the requirements for the future, and health and well-being came in there, and we've seen that increase as a growing agenda. We go down to the next element at 30%, then we have building refurbishment, and then at 20%, interestingly, living wage, you're looking at community engagement and also specification for sustainability products and services. So while being talked about, quite a low level of KPI or target set for those. And then finally, we get to the bottom group. This group includes not just sustainable travel and workplace design, but flexible working and social value. So again, we've seen the industry talk a lot about social value over the last 2 to 3 years. Increasingly, how we're able to define that or what we're doing doesn't seem to reflect how we're talking about it, because for those that are setting targets and KPIs, there are none. And this is one of the things that the Social Value Forum that the IWFM held this year, and again as part of, last year, 2018, as part of the same year's survey, is looking at what does it look like, how should it be defined, how can we measure it, because that way we can start to get more metrics and hopefully see that going up as far as KPIs and targets go. So, in finishing up and in encapsulating both what Munesh has said as well as what has come out to some of this year's survey findings, I'd like to finish with our overall conclusion and the future challenges, which says the importance of finding new approaches to sustainability is underlined by the latest report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has highlighted once again the need for businesses to take urgent action to combat rising global temperatures. Challenges for the facilities management sector to take the lead role in combining this environmental challenge with the growing social and longer term economic agendas. If through providing clear definitions and measurements, initiatives are then delivered illustrating how these challenges can be met to the benefit of the organisation, it will also ultimately benefit society, the planet and our industry too. It's not easy, but the opportunity is clearly there for our industry. As far as the report goes itself, it is 17 pages long. I would recommend it to you. Please do use it. Please take the information away from it. And also please look to consider and add to our worth of knowledge. As I said, it's the longest running survey of its kind in our industry, and your support with it in the future would be greatly appreciated. Alongside the survey, we have again this year provided 3 sets of infographics, slightly shorter, easier to digest. There's also a URL at the bottom that gives you a link to the survey, so there's no excuse for not having the information to be able to download it. 3 infographics we do have looks at the trends and barriers. There's one on sustainable procurement, and there's also a third that looks at social value. And again, they've been created by the Sustainability Special Interest Group committee members, and I'd like to thank Christine and Anne for their time in supporting those. Which leaves me with just one more thing to do. So what did these words mean? First one, hangry. It is lunchtime, and I know I'm stood here between you and your lunch, barring 1 or 2 questions, which is a feeling of anger or irritability when you get hungry. I hope there's not too many of us feeling that. Locanthropy is local and philanthropy, a commitment to deliberately and deliberatively local giving, which is something we're starting to see increasingly businesses do, looking into their local community as to what they can support. Pregret, knowing you shouldn't do something or you'll regret it, but doing it anyway. I think we've all been there. Vegangelical, this is a vegetarian or vegan who promotes their lifestyle and wants to convert everyone else to it as well. And then finally, TLDR, which is too long, don't read. As I did say, the survey is only 17 pages, so hopefully it's not too long, and hopefully we will all get time to read it. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, and again, thank you for going through the sustainability survey, and just echo the points about the survey is available, and encourage our attendees to read the report and cascade to others. We're aware of time, but we've got a few moments for some questions that we have been getting through as both our respective speakers have been going through their presentations. And it's one for both the speakers, is actually with so many priorities, which I think was echoed throughout the survey, as well as Manish's first opening couple of slides, really. What should the FM sector focus on particularly? So if I start with Manish and allow Greg a bit of respite, that would be great.
Thanks, Peter. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to pick one, but the good news is by doing one, the unintended consequences is that you achieve quite a number of them in any case, because they're so interconnected. So let's take making a building more carbon or energy efficient. Well, in many cases, by doing that, you also improve the health and well-being of its occupants. That's a great co-benefit of doing that. If you do that in a way in which you can increase the local employment, etc., you can do that in by creating more social value. And of course, you can also make sure that you do that in compliance with enhancing nature and biodiversity. In many cases, adding, for example, a green wall to a building can also act as insulation, which reduces its energy consumption. So I suppose there's no answer, and also actually enables it to become more resilient to excessive rainwater, etc. So there's no real answer to saying pick on one. The urgency around carbon and energy is undeniable, but the great thing is by focusing on that in the right way, and because it's interconnected to all the others, you can achieve many of the others.
That's great. And Greg, is there anything to add on to that? So basically, just to repeat the question, what should the FM sector focus on particularly?
Well, I think it's very much down to individual organisations. We've seen, as far as organisational engagement goes, that we do have this dichotomy over what executive managers see and what frontline staff see as being important, and it's this meeting in the middle. And I think it's combining what your organisation wants against what it can actually achieve, and setting targets where it can bring everybody together, so you're getting greater engagement to actually fulfilling those. And as Munish has said, that they're those ones that provide the greater benefit to the organisation in terms of its economic, its environmental, and its social impact. So I think the answer there is pick your challenges carefully.
Yeah, and I unfortunately not all of this is a quick fix either, I hasten to add. Tying in with the question we've got from Darren, so thank you, Darren, for your question. Different areas of the country recycle some items and not others. is there any intention, and I guess this is more about the waste management of the future, is there any intention that all areas of the country will recycle exactly the same items wherever you are? So I guess I don't know from respective speakers, does anyone feel comfortable answering that?
Peter, I'll have a quick go. I think this is another one of those systems questions. It's a very, very good point, and I thank my colleague for the question, because there is a great sort of disparity at the moment. But it starts, I suppose, with the way products are designed, and packaging in particular in terms of waste. So making sure that it's done in a more common way, a more widely recyclable way is really important. It's important then that, you know, local authorities have a consistency in the way that's all managed, and of course that supply chain that can recycle and reuse a lot of that material in a consistent way. So I think we're a bit way off that at the moment. There is a great deal of divergence right across the local authorities across the country. That's a good point. But until we get to that, I think we're going to sort of a period of transition.
Okay. And just another question there, Manish, as I've got you. We've had a question in from Michael, so thank you, Michael, for this. The UK figures that were represented in your presentation respectively, can this be split across the UK, i.e. England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I'm very sure they can. In my slides, I think in most cases I've quoted or put the logo off the actual source. And I'm sure that if you then seek out that source and find that particular report or that bit of data, it breaks it down by England, Scotland, etc., etc.
That's thank you for the answer, and hopefully that's addressed Michael's question, which I'm sure it has. I'm aware of time, and I just want to make respondents aware that we have captured all the questions. So as promised, we will, or I've not mentioned already, that as we've captured the questions, and we will pass on to the respective presenters today and ensure that an answer is sent back. We've got your details. So from that, we'll send the questions on to Manish and Greg to answer and get back in due course. So I want to say a massive thank you to Manish and Greg for joining us today on such an important subject for FM and the built environment, and generally everyone, because this does affect everyone. And as alluded to by Greg, as an institute, we are tackling the social value framework and developing work with the social value portal. We're also looking at guidance around sustainable procurement, and also have a live in action and a very strong sustainability SIG that will continue with the survey, but also we'll look at other methodologies throughout the year to continue the great work of the survey and bring back knowledge and guidance to the Institute. So, as well as its members, of course. So I just want to say a massive thank you to our speakers. Also to remind people that this webinar was live and will be available on our website. So please encourage your colleagues and fellow practitioners that weren't able to attend today's webinar to review the webinar, as there's a lot of information in there, and also encourage you to read the sustainability report. So once again, I just want to say a massive thank you for you listeners for tuning into our webinar today. There are a number of webinars being conducted throughout the year from the IWFM, so look forward to you joining them, and they will be on the events pages on our website, so they will be up in due course for the next areas of webinars we will be conducting throughout the year. So once again, thank you, and hope to join you soon in the near future. So thank you.